If you roll the tape back to the early 80s, you can almost smell the dust and premix in the air. America was deep into a boom of trail riding, enduro events, and desert races from Baja to the high desert. Riders wanted more than little play bikes, but they didn't all want to wrestle a full-blown open-class monster. Honda could see the gap opening right between the familiar XR350R and the big XR500R. The 250 was light, friendly, and easy to ride all day, but it ran out of breath when the trail opened up. The 500, and later the 600, had all the grunt in the world, but they were tall, heavy brutes, a handful for the average rider once the terrain got tight or the rider got tired. So from 1983 through 1985, Honda slipped in a third option, the XR350R. Built for riders with some experience who wanted real torque without hauling around 500, 600 weight. It arrived right as Honda was pushing its new RFVC 4-stroke XR family, and the 350 was meant to be a crucial middle link in that chain. And at the heart of that middleweight idea sat an engine that looked and sounded unlike anything Honda had built before. The XR350R carried the brand new RFVC design, radial 4-valve combustion, a clever 4-valve layout arranged like the petals of a flower around the combustion chamber. It was still a simple air-cooled SOHC 4-stroke, but the RFVC head breathed better, revved cleaner, and gave the bike a deeper, more confident thump than the old 2-valve mills ever could. In its first 2 years, 1983 and 1984, the XR350R ran a 339 cubic centimeter version of that RFVC engine, built around a wet sump system with the oil carried inside the crankcase. It made roughly 22 horsepower, depending on the market, which doesn't sound like much today, but in the early 80s, it felt lively and eager, especially in the tighter parts of a trail. Then came 1985, and Honda refined the whole package. Displacement bumped up to about 353 to 354 cubic centimeters, and more importantly, the bike switched to a dry sump system, storing its oil in the frame. That change alone helped the engine run cooler, stay lubricated under hard climbing, and survive longer under the kind of abuse off-road riders were famous for. Power crept upward too, with many period reports placing the later engines in the 30 to 33 horsepower range. Paired with a 6-speed transmission, the RFVC gave the XR350R a personality all its own. Smooth on the bottom, strong in the mid-range, and willing to pull cleanly across the kind of mixed terrain American riders loved. As good as that RFVC engine was, the way it breathed was really what shaped the XR350R's reputation, fair or not. In 1983 and 1984, Honda fed the 339 cubic centimeter motor with a pair of progressive K-HIN carburetors. One opened first, the second came in later, giving the bike a smooth, almost refined pull as the revs climbed. Riders loved the throttle response when everything was dialed in. The bike felt crisp, clean, and surprisingly eager for a mid-size 4-stroke. But that setup had a sharp edge. 2 carbs meant twice the jets, twice the diaphragms, twice the sync work. As those early RFVC engines aged, even a little wear or a slight vacuum leak could throw the pair out of balance. Plenty of riders in the 80s, especially weekend riders without a shop manual handy, complained that the twin-carb XR350R was a sweetheart on the trail and a headache in the garage. More than a few bikes earned an unfair reputation simply because their carbs had drifted out of sync. Honda listened. In 1985, the XR350R switched to a single, larger carburetor, and the change transformed the bike's personality. It started easier, tuned easier, and held its settings longer. Combined with the new dry sump oil system, the 85 model ran cooler, smoother, and generally felt finished in a way the earlier versions never quite did. That contrast, fussy twin-carb years, followed by a nearly flawless final year, is the core of the XR350R story. Misunderstood at first, but at its best in 1985, when all the pieces finally came together. All of that engine work sat inside a chassis built for the kind of riding Americans were doing in the early 80s. The XR350R used a classic steel tube enduro frame, tall and narrow, with a high-mounted fuel tank, a long, straight seat, and a high-riding exhaust tucked in tight for trail clearance. It looked every bit the part of a serious off-road machine. Depending on the year, the bike weighed between 247 and 267 pounds dry, a number that placed it squarely between the nimble 250 and the heavyweight 500. That middle ground feel was part of its charm. Light enough to flick through tight woods, stout enough to stay planted when the trail opened up. With a seat height of around 36 inches, the XR350R wasn't built for beginners. You needed a confident leg and a bit of experience to swing a boot over it, especially on uneven ground. But in return, the bike offered excellent ground clearance, letting riders crawl over rocks, roots, and ledges without catching the frame. On the trail, the chassis had a balance all its own. More stable than a 250, far less lumbering than a 500. It was exactly what Honda set out to build, a true mid-size enduro, made for riders who wanted something right in the sweet spot. Honda matched that well-balanced chassis with suspension that fit the era and the mission perfectly. Up front, the XR350R carried a set of 41mm Showa forks with air-adjustable preload and roughly 11 inches of travel. They soaked up small rocks and washboard chatter with ease, giving the bike a smooth, steady feel in the kind of mid-speed trail riding most owners spent their weekends doing. Out back, Honda's ProLink rear suspension paired a gas-charged Showa shock with nearly 270 to 290 millimeters of travel, depending on the year. It was a setup riders trusted. Supple enough to track over loose ground, firm enough to hold the bike together when the terrain suddenly turned rough. Braking followed the off-road norms of the early 80s. A single front disc that offered solid stopping power for the time, backed by a rear drum brake, simple and reliable in mud, dust, and creek crossings. Together, the suspension and brakes gave the XR350R a natural, predictable feel. Soft enough to stay comfortable, stiff enough to stay in control. The bike carried itself with a confidence that made it a favorite on long, winding trails where terrain could change in the blink of an eye. Out on the trail, the XR350R's personality came alive in a way numbers on a spec sheet could never fully explain. That RFVC head gave the bike a strong, steady wave of mid-range torque, the kind that didn't rip your arms off, but pulled with a confidence that made hill climbs feel easier and tight. Technical, single track, far less intimidating. You didn't have to rev it to the moon. Just roll into the throttle and let the engine's natural rhythm do the work. Because it was lighter than an XR500 or XR600, the 350 didn't wear a rider down as the hours ticked by. In deep woods or rocky canyons, that weight difference mattered. It meant fewer moments where you had to fight the bike or wrestle it upright when you misjudged a rut. Yet compared to the featherier XR250R, the 350 felt more planted at speed, less prone to deflecting off roots or dancing when the trail opened up. The 6-speed transmission gave the bike a versatility riders appreciated. First, second, and third handled the slow, twisty stuff where throttle control mattered. Slide into 5th or 6th, and the XR350R settled into an easy lope, comfortable on fire roads, desert washes, or any stretch where you could breathe a little and enjoy the view. Its nature sat right between worlds. Not wild and explosive like a 2-stroke, not mild or underpowered like a smaller 4-stroke. It was smooth, predictable, and quietly capable. Exactly the kind of character riders who grew up in the 80s still remember fondly. For all its strengths, the XR350R wasn't without its rough edges, And being honest about them is part of understanding why the bike never reached the popularity of its bigger and smaller siblings. The most talked about issue was the twin-carb setup on the 83 and 84 models. When perfectly synced, it ran beautifully, but keeping it that way took patience and a steady hand. A little wear, a tiny vacuum leak, or a float slightly out of spec could throw the pair off balance, earning those early bikes a reputation for being fussy and unpredictable. The wet sump engine layout used in the first 2 years didn't help either. On long, hot climbs or extended hard runs, the engine could run noticeably warmer, especially if oil levels weren't watched closely. And like many early RFVC heads, some riders reported cracking issues, almost always on bikes that were run low on oil or jetted poorly, but the stories stuck. Durability was generally good, but not quite on the legendary level of the XR350R or the big XR500R. Push the 350 too hard too often, and it didn't shrug it off the same way its siblings did. Because the XR350R lived in a niche between classes, it never sold in huge numbers. Today, that makes certain parts harder to find, especially for the early twin-carb versions. For collectors, it's part of the charm. For restorers, it's something to plan ahead for. Honda must have known the XR350R was close to being something truly special, because in 1985, they gave it the kind of thoughtful overhaul that fixed nearly every complaint riders had voiced in the first 2 years. The biggest change was the switch to a dry sump system, moving the oil up into the frame the way Honda would later do on the XR600R. That single decision transformed how the bike handled heat. It ran cooler on long climbs, held pressure better on rough ground, and generally aged more gracefully under the kind of punishment off-road riding delivers. Just as important was the move to a single large carburetor. Gone were the days of synchronizing 2 finicky keyhins. The 85 model started easier, idled cleaner, and stayed in tune far longer. For everyday riders, especially those without a garage full of tools, it made the bike feel friendlier, more predictable, and far less high maintenance. Honda also revised the frame and oil routing, tightening the package and borrowing ideas directly from the XR600R development program. The result was a machine that felt more planted, more unified, and more confident across the board. Because of these improvements, the 1985 XR350R earned a reputation that has only grown with time. The best sorted, most reliable, and most collectible version of the 350. It was the year the bike finally became everything Honda meant it to be. When you place the XR350R next to the machines it shared showroom space with, its role in the early 80s becomes a lot clearer. Compared to the XR250R, the 350 carried more muscle and felt noticeably more planted on fast or choppy terrain. But that extra strength came with extra weight, which meant it rewarded riders with a bit of skill and confidence, people who already knew their way around a trail. Stack it against the XR500R or XR600R, and the balance shifts the other way. The big-bore XRs had brute force and endless torque, but they were heavier, taller, and more demanding when the trail tightened up. The XR350R felt lighter on its feet, easier to turn, and far less tiring on long rides. What it didn't have was the sheer, arm-stretching punch that made the open-class bikes legends. And then there were the two strokes of the day: KDX 200, IT 250, PE 175. Quick revving, light, and explosive off the bottom. Riders who wanted that sharp, aggressive hit usually went straight to a two-stroke. But riders who preferred torque, durability, and fewer rebuilds gravitated toward the XR350R's steadier four-stroke rhythm. In the end, the 350 sat squarely between two worlds. Not too light, not too heavy, not too wild, not too mild. It was a bike for riders who knew exactly what they wanted. Today, the XR350R occupies a quiet but special corner of the off-road world, One of those bikes whose value grows not because it was a bestseller, but because it wasn't. With only a short production run, the 350 became naturally rare, and that scarcity has pushed its collectible appeal upward year after year. Among enthusiasts, the 1985 model stands at the top of the list. Dry sump, single carb, cooler running, easier to tune, and simply the most sorted version Honda ever built. Surprisingly, the aftermarket hasn't abandoned it. You can still find pistons, cams, carb kits, plastics, and rebuild parts, enough to keep a well-loved XR350R alive for decades. And for riders now in their 60s or 70s, men who once rode these machines when they were new, there's a deep nostalgia baked into the sound of that RFVC thump. Denim jeans, a white t-shirt, dust hanging in the air, and the steady rhythm of a four-stroke climbing a summer trail. In the XR family, the 350 remains a hidden gem, quiet, overlooked, and unforgettable once you've ridden one. If this brought back memories, hit like, share your XR stories in the comments, and subscribe for more rides down memory lane.